Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning into my talk. My name's Dan Baldessari, and I'm going to tell you about itinerant breeding in a songbird. I first want to acknowledge all my co-authors that helped me out with this study. Let's take a look at the Phainopepla here. This is a small songbird that you can find throughout Mexico and the southwestern United States. And behaviorally, the interesting thing about this guy is that they seem to exhibit this behavior called itinerant breeding. And what that means is simply that they breed twice during the same breeding season in two distinct locations. And the Phainopepla is particularly interesting because they appear to move between two drastically different physical and social environments. So they first breed in deserts where they are territorial, and then they later show up in woodland habitats and breed a second time in loose colonies. But the kicker here is that people didn't know whether these were truly connected populations. Itinerant breeding would require that an actual individual bird is capable of moving between these two different locations, modulating their behavior in a pretty significant way in order to be successful breeding in these two very different contexts. The alternative is that these are actually cryptically distinct populations, that there are desert and woodland specialists. So these are the alternatives that I sought to try and distinguish between. So I worked with these birds in the Mojave Desert at a site where they were breeding, and I did two main things. The first thing that I did was capture a bunch of birds at the end of this desert breeding period and put some GPS tags on them. So these are really lightweight tags that allow the birds to fly around freely and record their movement behavior. So you get really nice high resolution data showing exactly where these birds have been over the intervening months. And you can simply ask, do these woodland birds that have shown up in these woodland habitats, have they come from desert habitats where they bred prior? And I'm going to show you GPS data from 5 individuals. And we're going to pair those movement data with some population genomics data. So we're also going to look and see, do woodland and desert breeding birds come from distinct genetic populations, or do they all look as though they come from the same gene pool? And so we're going to do a population genomic analysis here to look for genetic clusters, essentially. And if we see a lack of clustering or a lack of population structure between desert and woodland populations, that would suggest itinerant breeding. That would suggest that individual birds are moving between those two habitat types and promoting gene flow. So let's look at the movement data first here. We're going to show a little bit of an animation here of these 5 birds moving across the landscape, and we're going to start in March as they leave that Mojave Desert breeding site. So here we are in the Mojave Desert. These birds have finished breeding. They start to wander around a little bit in the spring, have a little bit of a stopover before May, and certainly by June, you'll see all 5 of these birds set up shop in some coastal oak woodland habitat. They stay put and don't move for June and July, essentially, and then start to head back down to the deserts in late summer and fall, have a little bit of a stopover period in distinct locations before they return to that original desert breeding site. And we'll watch it one more time. The birds leave that Mojave Desert site. You'll see them each head to a little bit of a spring stopover site before they make their way out to the coasts. By June, they've all set up shop in a nice oak tree somewhere. They're not going anywhere for June and July. They're breeding during that time period. Then they start to get antsy, head back down to the deserts. If you look down in the bottom right, you'll see the purple and the blue bird, for example, have a little bit of a stopover in Mexico before they eventually head back up to that original Mojave Desert breeding site to start the process over again. And if we look at the population genomic data, we see a complete lack of genetic structure. So if you look at the panel on the bottom there, each of those different colors represents birds from a different breeding site. And we have desert and woodland birds mixed in together on that figure. And you'll see they all cluster right on top of each other. So there's no structure that suggests they're all coming from the same gene pool. Birds are moving in between those two habitat types exchanging genes exactly as we would expect if there was itinerant breeding going on. So we have two compatible lines of evidence here that suggest pretty strongly that the Phainopepla is an itinerant breeder. We've got some really clear-cut, simple movement data that show that desert breeding birds go on to move to woodland habitats and breed a second time. And we have some nice population genomic data that go along with that that show a lack of structure genetically between these two habitat types. So the cool thing behaviorally is that there's got to be some pretty serious behavioral plasticity that underlies this. These individual birds have to really modulate their hormones, their migratory behavior, their social behavior in order to breed successfully in these two drastically different habitat types. So that's probably why this is a very rare behavior for birds. And please tune in later to ask questions.